Officer Daniel Hayes adjusted his badge and took a slow sip from his water bottle as he leaned against his patrol car, the heat radiating off the pavement. It had been a slow afternoon, just the usual routine checks, minor traffic stops, and patrolling near the quieter parts of town. But then, something tugged at his boot. He looked down and froze. Two tiny twin lion cubs stood there, their golden fur dusty and matted. Their eyes, wide, frightened, and desperate, locked onto his. They weren't running. Instead, they let out soft, broken cries, their tiny paws scratching at his boots. "What the—" Hayes knelt, reaching a cautious hand toward them, but before he could touch them, the cubs bolted forward, then stopped, turning back to look at him. They wanted him to follow. His police instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. Straightening, he followed them cautiously. The cubs weaved between old crates and broken fences, their bodies low, tails tucked in fear, not playfulness. They ran with purpose. The further they led him, the quieter it became. They turned into a narrow alley lined with abandoned buildings where weeds crept through cracked concrete. The air felt heavy, like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, Hayes saw it. A few feet ahead, near a pile of discarded wooden pallets, a full-grown lion lay motionless on the ground. Hayes' heart pounded. She was wounded, barely breathing. Blood stained the dirt near her massive paws, and her golden coat was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her chest rose and fell in weak, uneven gasps. The cubs rushed to her side, nuzzling against her lifeless body, letting out high-pitched whimpers. Hayes swallowed hard. He had seen tragedy before. Abandoned dogs, hit-and-run victims, even cases of human neglect. But this? A mother lion, collapsed in an alley, her twin cubs desperately calling for help? It didn't make sense. He stepped forward carefully, kneeling beside the lioness. Her eyes fluttered open, weak, terrified. Her breathing hitched as if she barely had the strength to react. What the hell happened here? Hayes scanned the area. Something felt off. A few feet away, tangled in the grass, he noticed something metallic. A dart. Tranquilizer? Poachers? His grip tightened around his radio. "This is Officer Hayes. I need an emergency response team, now. I have a critically injured lion and 2 cubs at my location. Potential poaching incident." Static crackled. Then a voice. "A lion? Are you sure?" Hayes glanced at the cubs, who were now curled up against their mother, their tiny bodies trembling. "Yeah," he said, his voice sharp, "and someone did this on purpose." Somewhere nearby, behind one of the old buildings, something moved. Hayes turned sharply. He wasn't alone. Officer Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on his radio, his pulse pounding against his ribs. The twin lion cubs whimpered, nudging against their mother's still body, their small cries sending a dull ache through his chest. This wasn't just a random wildlife sighting. This was a crime scene. He crouched beside the lioness, his fingers hovering over the tranquilizer dart sticking out from the overgrown grass. It wasn't an old, rusted relic. This was fresh. Someone had been here recently. But who? And more importantly, why? Hayes exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. The mother lion was still breathing, though each rise and fall of her chest was labored, her muscles twitching involuntarily. She was fighting to hold on. The cubs stayed close, their tiny bodies trembling. One of them let out a weak growl, a feeble attempt at defense or fear. Hayes knew he had to move fast, but how? His hand hovered over his radio again. He could call animal control, but his gut twisted at the thought, because he had been here before. Hayes had joined the police force nearly a decade ago, but before that he had dreamed of working in conservation. In his early years on the job, he had volunteered with a wildlife rescue unit, helping relocate animals caught in human territories. He had seen the worst sides of humanity. Exotic pets dumped when they became too much to handle, injured animals left for dead, poachers trying to profit from pain. One case haunted him more than any other. A few years back, he had responded to a call about a caged tiger cub left outside a warehouse. The cub had been starved, its body frail, ribs showing beneath its striped coat. Hayes had gotten it to a rescue center, but it was too late. The cub hadn't made it. The sight of it had stuck with him, the helplessness, the betrayal written in the animal's eyes. And now, staring at the lioness and her two desperate cubs, that same anger curled in his chest. He wasn't about to let this happen again. Hayes glanced around, scanning the alleyway and surrounding buildings. The area was mostly abandoned, save for a few run-down structures, their windows broken, their doors hanging off hinges. It didn't add up. If this was a zoo escape, there would have been alerts. If this was a simple case of an injured wild animal, the scene wouldn't feel so deliberate. Then he saw it. Tire tracks. Faint but fresh, pressed into the dry dirt near the alley's entrance. A large vehicle had been here recently. His eyes flicked back to the tranquilizer dart. Someone had tried to capture this lion, and when things didn't go as planned, they had left her to die. His jaw clenched. No, not today. He reached for his radio. "This is Officer Hayes. I have an injured lion and 2 cubs. I need immediate wildlife rescue support at my location." The response was delayed. Then dispatch finally crackled in. "Officer Hayes, are you confirming a lion? In an alley?" "Yes, and she's been tranquilized. There's evidence of illegal activity. I need backup and animal rescue now." Silence. Then hesitation. Stand by, Officer Hayes. Wildlife Services is limited in your area. We're checking for available resources." His stomach tightened. Limited? That wasn't a real answer. Something was off. Why was there reluctance instead of urgency? Were they stalling? He looked back at the cubs, now curled against their mother's side. The lioness gave a weak huff, her body barely shifting. She didn't have hours to wait for a slow-moving response. Hayes made a decision. If no one else was going to help, he would. His patrol car wasn't built for transporting wild animals, but he wasn't about to let a mother die while her cubs watched. Ignoring protocol, he grabbed a blanket from his trunk, moving carefully back toward the lioness. "This is Officer Hayes," he said into his radio, his voice firm. "If rescue can't arrive soon, I'll be transporting the animals myself." He draped the blanket over the lioness, testing her reaction. She barely flinched, too weak to resist. "Easy, girl," he murmured. The cubs watched him cautiously, their tiny ears flattened. When he gently lifted their mother, one of the cubs let out a high-pitched whine and tugged at his sleeve with its tiny teeth. Hayes froze. It didn't want to let her go. A lump formed in his throat. "I'm going to save her," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. With slow, careful movements, he hoisted the lioness into his back seat, adjusting her so she wouldn't press on her wound. The cubs hesitated for only a moment before scrambling in beside her. They trusted him. Now, he just had to make sure that trust wasn't misplaced. Hayes slammed the car door shut and hit the gas. He was getting them out of here before whoever did this came back to finish the job. Officer Daniel Hayes kept one hand on the wheel and the other gripping his radio. His patrol car bounced slightly as he sped down the uneven roads leading out of the abandoned district, twin lion cubs curled up against their barely conscious mother in the back seat. The urgency in his chest hadn't lessened. The lioness was still alive, for now. But something about this whole situation wasn't adding up. He pressed the radio button. "This is Officer Hayes. I'm en route with an injured lion and 2 cubs. Any update on wildlife rescue?" A few seconds passed. Then the dispatcher's voice crackled back through. "Wildlife Services is still checking for availability. Stand by." Hayes's grip tightened on the wheel. Still checking? The lioness was dying. The cubs were terrified. What was there to check? Something felt off. Wildlife rescue usually jumped at emergency calls like this. Injured apex predators weren't exactly common. It wasn't the kind of case that got put on hold. He took a deep breath. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe they really were just short-staffed. Still, his instincts screamed at him that this wasn't normal. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The cubs were still curled up beside their mother, their small bodies trembling. The lioness let out a weak exhale, but she didn't move. She was fading. Hayes couldn't just sit and wait for a response that might never come. He turned the car sharply, heading back to the scene. If the system wasn't going to do its job, he'd find out what happened himself. The alley was just as silent as before when Hayes pulled in. Stepping out of his patrol car, he took in the scene again. But this time, he was looking for evidence. His boots crunched against the dirt as he moved toward where the lioness had been found. That's when he noticed it. A second dart. His chest tightened. The first one he found near the lioness hadn't been a mistake. Someone had shot her at least twice. And then he saw something else. Footprints. Faint impressions in the dry dirt, leading away from the alley. Someone had been here recently. Not only had they shot the lion, they had been close. Hayes scanned the area. The trail of footprints led toward the back of one of the old buildings. A door, slightly ajar, creaked in the wind. Someone had been here, and they might still be nearby. His heartbeat sped up. Hand instinctively hovering over his holster, he moved toward the door. Inside, the air was stale, dusty with disuse. Sunlight cut through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating the otherwise dark space. It looked abandoned, but Hayes' trained eye picked up something that didn't belong. A folding table against the far wall, stacked with documents, maps, and weapons. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a staging ground. He stepped closer, brushing dirt off a stack of papers. The words jumped out at him immediately. Live export permits, unprocessed. Transport schedule. High-risk cargo. Buyer requests. Big cats. Hayes's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what this was. Animal traffickers, illegal wildlife smugglers, and they weren't just poachers, they were planning something big. He quickly snapped a few pictures with his phone, documenting everything. As he turned to leave, a noise from outside made him freeze. Footsteps. Someone was coming. He moved fast, pressing himself into the shadows of the room just as the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, a man in dark cargo pants and a vest, a radio clipped to his belt. He muttered something into it, low, irritated. Hayes couldn't make out all of it, but he heard enough. Escaped before we could secure it. Someone called it in. The man walked toward the table, flipping through the papers Hayes had just been looking at. If he turned around, he'd see him. Hayes inched backward, careful not to make a sound. But then, his radio crackled. Loud. Clear. "Officer Hayes, we have a status update on your request." The man froze. Then he spun around. Their eyes met. Shit. Hayes moved first. With a single step forward, he grabbed the nearest wooden crate and shoved it over, sending the stack of documents scattering. The man swore and lunged, but Hayes was already moving, pushing past him toward the door. He burst into the alley, sprinting toward his car. A gunshot rang out. Dirt exploded near his boot, but he didn't stop. Throwing himself into the driver's seat, he slammed the door shut and hit the gas. In his rearview mirror, he saw the man stumble into the alley, frantically yelling into his radio. He was calling for backup. Hayes didn't stop until he was miles away. Pulling onto a side road, he finally let out a breath. His hands were still shaking against the steering wheel. Then, a soft noise from the back seat. He turned. The twin lion cubs were still curled against their mother, but now they were staring at him, wide-eyed, trusting. One of them let out a tiny, exhausted whimper, not out of fear but relief. They weren't just scared anymore. They knew he was their only hope, and Hayes knew one thing for sure: whoever had done this wasn't finished. They were coming back, and this time he was ready for them. The engine of Officer Daniel Hayes' patrol car hummed beneath him as he pulled into the side road, his hands still trembling slightly from the near escape. In the rearview mirror, twin, golden eyes stared at him. The two lion cubs were curled tightly against their mother's side, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each shallow breath she took. They weren't crying anymore. They were watching him. They trusted him. That made the weight on Hayes's chest even heavier. He couldn't let them down. Hayes's mind raced as he pieced together everything he had seen. The documents at the abandoned warehouse. The permit applications with words like live export, and big cats. The dart wounds on the lioness, the gunshot that nearly took him out. This wasn't just a case of a wounded wild animal. This was organized crime. He reached for his phone and quickly scrolled through his law enforcement contacts. If traffickers were involved, he needed someone who could confirm it. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hayes? Damn, it's been a while." Detective Mason Ward, an old friend from the Environmental Crimes Task Force. Hayes wasted no time. "I need a favor, Mason. Animal smuggling, big operation. Lions, maybe more. I just found a mother and 2 cubs targeted by poachers. The mother's wounded. The cubs are scared, and I think I just walked into their hideout." Silence on the other end. Then Mason sighed. "Damn it, Hayes. This is bad." Mason's voice lowered. "There's been a spike in big cat trafficking. We've been monitoring a group of high-end smugglers, guys who don't just hunt for sport. They steal live animals, selling them to exotic pet collectors or private zoos." Hayes's stomach twisted. "Are they local?" he asked. Mason hesitated. "No, they're well connected. Government loopholes, dirty law enforcement, offshore buyers, the kind of guys who make people disappear." Hayes glanced back at the cubs. "So, why attack this lioness?" Mason exhaled. She was likely being tracked. That means she was either high value or she witnessed something she wasn't supposed to. Either way, whoever did this is going to want her back. Hayes felt a chill crawl up his spine. "So, what do I do?" Mason's answer was grim. "You run, you hide, and you don't let them know you have those cubs." Hayes let Mason's words sink in. Then, a soft nuzzle at his arm. He turned. One of the cubs had crawled up toward the front seat, tiny paws resting against the console, its bright amber eyes locked onto his. Curious, hesitant. Then, it licked his wrist. Hayes let out a slow breath. He wasn't used to being trusted this quickly. He reached out carefully, letting his fingers graze over the cub's soft fur. It flinched slightly, but after a moment, it leaned into his touch. The second cub followed, pressing its tiny body against his arm. They weren't afraid of him anymore. They had chosen him, and Hayes had already chosen them. He wasn't letting them go. He couldn't sit still. He needed more evidence. If these traffickers were bold enough to operate in broad daylight, they had to have left a trail. And he knew exactly where to check. He drove toward a gas station 2 blocks from the alley where he had found the lioness. The cashier was a teenager with dark circles under his eyes, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as Hayes walked in. "Hey," Hayes said, flashing his badge. "I need to see your security footage from today." The kid frowned. Sure? What are you looking for?" "Anything strange," Hayes said, keeping his voice even. "Unusual trucks, people carrying crates, anything that looks out of place." The cashier shrugged and pulled up the footage. The moment Hayes saw it, his gut turned to ice. There it was, a black SUV with tinted windows. It had stopped for only 3 minutes, just long enough for a man in cargo pants and a tactical vest to step out, talking on a burner phone. Then, another vehicle pulled in behind it, an unmarked van. The side door slid open, and 2 men carried a large cage inside. The timestamp? Minutes before Hayes had arrived in the alley. He leaned in closer. The man on the phone turned slightly, giving the camera a glimpse of his face. And Hayes's blood went cold. He knew him. Not from the streets, not from a criminal record. From inside the system. The man was John Archer. A high-ranking wildlife officer. Hayes barely made it back to his car before his phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up. Static. Then, a slow, controlled voice. "Walk away, Hayes." Hayes's grip tightened on his phone. The voice continued. "You have no idea what you're messing with. Let the animals go. This isn't your fight." Hayes felt a rage rise in his chest. "This isn't a fight?" he growled. "Then why are you afraid of me finding out the truth?" Silence. Then, a low chuckle. "Oh, you still don't get it, do you?" the voice murmured. "This was never about the lions." A click. The call ended. Hayes stared at his phone. This wasn't just about smuggling, this was bigger, and now they knew his name. Hayes put his phone down. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw it. A black SUV, same make, same model. Following. Not speeding, just staying exactly 2 cars behind. Watching. Waiting. Hayes's jaw clenched. They had found him, and they weren't going to let him go that easily. Officer Daniel Hayes kept his eyes on the black SUV trailing him in the rearview mirror. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Whoever was behind this wasn't just poachers or traffickers. They were connected, powerful enough to track his movements within hours of him finding the lioness and her cubs. But that wasn't the worst part. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an unknown number, it was his police chief. A bad feeling settled in Hayes's gut as he answered. "Hayes, where are you?" Chief Dawson's voice was low, clipped. "I've got an injured lioness and her cubs. They need immediate care. I called for wildlife rescue, but that's why I'm calling." Hayes's stomach dropped. "We're shutting this case down." Silence. Hayes' jaw clenched. "Excuse me?" "I just got word from higher-ups. This is beyond our jurisdiction. We're not animal control. If wildlife services won't take them, you're to leave them where you found them." Hayes's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. "You're telling me to dump 2 defenseless cubs and their dying mother in an alley?" he said, his voice dangerously low. Chief Dawson exhaled sharply. "I don't like this any more than you do, but the order came from above me. Someone wants this case buried, and they have the power to do it." Hayes ended the call without another word, slamming his phone onto the dashboard. He was alone in this now. His attention snapped back to the lioness in the back seat. She let out a weak, pained groan. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. The cubs pressed close against her, their tiny bodies trembling. Hayes swallowed hard. She wasn't going to make it much longer. His mind raced. He couldn't take them to a public animal hospital, not if powerful people wanted them dead. He couldn't just leave them to die. Then an idea hit him. There was one place left. Hayes turned the car sharply, heading toward an old friend's property. Dr. Ellen Carter, a private wildlife veterinarian. The facility was secluded, outside city limits. Ellen had spent years treating exotic animals confiscated from illegal traders. If anyone could help, it was her. When Hayes arrived, Ellen was already outside, arms crossed. "Daniel," she called as he pulled in, eyeing the lioness in the back seat. "What the hell did you bring me?" "Trouble," he admitted, swinging the door open. Ellen moved fast. Within minutes, she had the lioness on a stretcher, hooked up to fluids. The cubs refused to leave her side. Hayes helped steady the lioness as Ellen checked for wounds. Then she froze. "Wait," Ellen muttered, her brows furrowing. She reached into her supply kit and pulled out a scanner. She waved it over the lioness's side. The screen beeped. Hayes' blood ran cold. "What is that?" he demanded. Ellen turned the screen toward him. A small, circular foreign object showed up in the scan, inside the lioness. A tracking device. Someone had been monitoring her movements. Ellen carefully extracted the small metallic device from beneath the lioness's skin. Hayes grabbed a towel, wiping the blood away. His heart was pounding. Tracking devices weren't unusual for conservation purposes, but this wasn't a conservation tag. This was a private GPS unit. Hayes took a photo and sent it to Mason Ward, his contact at the Environmental Crimes Task Force. Seconds later, Mason's reply popped up. "Mason, get rid of that thing, now. If they planted a tracker, they already know where you are." Hayes's stomach flipped. He turned to Ellen. "Destroy it." Without hesitation, Ellen crushed the device under her boot. The lioness had settled, breathing easier now, but her cubs were still restless. One of them climbed onto Hayes's lap, tiny paws gripping his uniform. The other pressed against his leg, trembling. Hayes ran a hand over their fur, trying to calm them. They knew something was wrong. Animals could sense danger, and Hayes wasn't about to ignore that instinct. Mason called him this time. I traced the tracking device's manufacturer. It was registered to a private security firm, one linked to Dominic Voss. Hayes's breath hitched. Dominic Voss, a billionaire investor, a notorious game hunter, the owner of private animal reserves across multiple countries, and a suspected wildlife trafficker. No convictions, no official records, just whispers in the black market trade. If Voss had planted the tracker, it meant he owned the lioness, and he would do anything to get her back. Hayes stood up. He could feel the weight of the moment. If Voss was behind this, he wouldn't stop. The police weren't going to help. The system was compromised. That left Hayes with only one choice. He turned to Ellen. I need to disappear. Ellen's eyes widened. What? You saw the tracker. You saw the SUV tailing me. Whoever did this has people on the inside. If I turn the cubs and their mother over, they'll end up dead. Ellen hesitated. What are you saying, Hayes? He looked at her. I'm taking them off the grid. Ellen inhaled sharply. That's illegal, Daniel. He knew. He didn't care. These cubs don't stand a chance if I follow the law. He met her gaze, voice steady. I'm not losing them. Silence. Then Ellen nodded. Then let's do it right. She grabbed a set of keys from her desk. I know a place. Hayes let out a breath. The rules had just changed. And now? He wasn't playing by them anymore. Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against the dimly lit counter of the small veterinary clinic, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The lioness and her cubs were hidden for now, but that wouldn't last. Dominic Voss, billionaire, trafficker, hunter, was coming for them. Hayes needed help. Someone outside the system. Someone the traffickers couldn't reach. His fingers flew over his phone screen as he typed a message to Leah Foster, an investigative journalist known for exposing wildlife smuggling rings and corrupt officials. Hayes, need to meet. Off record. Big case. Dangerous. Lives at risk. Seconds later, 3 dots appeared. Then, her reply. Leah, name the place, but if you're lying, you owe me dinner. Hayes smirked. That was Leah, always cracking jokes, until the story got real. And this was as real as it got. The next morning, Hayes was checking his burner phone when he saw the headline that made his blood boil. Breaking news. Dominic Voss files for immediate seizure of stolen big cats. Stolen. Hayes clenched his fists. Voss was flipping the narrative. According to the article, Voss had legally purchased the lioness and her cubs from a breeding facility. He was now accusing Hayes of illegally interfering. They were manipulating the law to get them back. If Hayes lost this battle, the cubs and their mother would end up in one of Voss's private reserves. Translation, they'd vanish. He couldn't let that happen. That night, Hayes met Leah in a rundown cafe, the kind of place where no one asked questions. She was already waiting, her laptop open, sipping coffee like they had all the time in the world. You look like hell, she greeted, arching a brow. Thanks, Hayes muttered, sliding into the seat across from her. He handed over a USB drive filled with everything he'd found so far. The tracking device, the smuggling documents, the security footage. Leah whistled. Damn, you weren't kidding. I need you to go public with this, Hayes said. Fast, before Voss wins. Leah nodded, but hesitated. You know what this means, right? If we take him down, he'll come after you. Hayes' jaw tightened. He already is. While Leah worked on exposing the story, Hayes had another mission. He needed to find where Voss was keeping the rest of his animals. He had a lead, a warehouse property Voss owned outside the city, but it was the cubs who gave him his biggest break. That afternoon, while tending to the lioness, he noticed one of the cubs pawing at a folded piece of paper tucked into the vet's old supply cabinet. Curious, Hayes pulled it out. An old receipt for custom animal transport, signed with the initials DV. His stomach dropped. It wasn't just lions. Voss had been moving more animals, regularly. And the location listed? The same warehouse he had suspected. That night, Hayes parked a mile from the warehouse. Armed with a flashlight and his sidearm, he moved through the darkened loading area, avoiding the cameras. Inside, he found rows of shipping crates, stacked and sealed. And then, a sound. A low, rumbling growl. Hayes's stomach turned as he aimed his flashlight between the bars of a nearby cage. Inside, a sedated tiger. More cages filled with animals in distress, some pacing, others lying still. Voss wasn't just dealing with lions. This was full-scale international wildlife trafficking, and Hayes had just found the evidence he needed. Hayes reached for his phone to take pictures, but before he could press the button, a harsh voice cut through the silence. "Turn around. Slowly." Cold metal pressed against the back of his head. "Gun." Hayes's heartbeat slammed in his ears. A second voice spoke up. "You really should have walked away, officer." Then, everything went black. Officer Daniel Hayes woke up to the dull ache in his head and the cold bite of metal around his wrists. His arms were bound behind him, his body slumped in a metal chair in what looked like a storage room inside the warehouse. His vision blurred, but he could still make out the faint growls and cries of caged animals nearby. Then, a voice. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Through the haze, Hayes forced himself to focus as Dominic Voss stepped forward. Dressed in an expensive suit, he looked out of place in the grimy, makeshift smuggling facility. A smirk played on his lips as he picked up a hunting knife from a nearby crate. "You know," Voss continued, twirling the blade, "I usually pay people to clean up my messes, but in this case, I wanted to do it myself." Hayes let out a breath, steadying himself. "If you kill a cop," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "you won't be able to cover it up." Voss laughed. "I don't need to. I'll just say you were a rogue officer, that you stole protected animals, tampered with evidence, even took bribes." He crouched next to Hayes. "Who do you think the world will believe? A disgraced cop or a billionaire philanthropist?" Hayes' jaw tightened. "Don't look so mad, officer. Your mistake was thinking this was about the lions." Voss leaned in closer. "It's bigger than that. You think I'm some poacher? I own people, countries, industries. A few animals are nothing compared to what I control." Hayes locked eyes with him. Then a noise. A soft, high-pitched whimper. Hayes's stomach clenched. One of the twin lion cubs had somehow squeezed through the door crack. It looked up at him, its tail flicking, small claws scratching at the floor as if trying to reach him. Hayes's throat tightened. They had followed him, they trusted him, and that meant they were in danger. Voss sighed, shaking his head. "Damn, things are persistent, aren't they?" He signaled to his guard. "Get rid of it." No. Hayes lunged forward, ignoring the pain in his wrists as he slammed both feet into the guard's knee. The man yelled in pain, collapsing as Hayes used the momentum to twist himself sideways, sending his chair crashing to the floor. The cub yowled and darted under a crate. Voss swore and grabbed his gun. But Hayes was already moving. Still bound, Hayes rolled onto his knees, swinging his shoulder into Voss's gut as hard as he could. The billionaire stumbled backward, dropping his gun just as Hayes used his bound hands to grab the fallen knife. One swift movement, and the plastic zip tie around his wrists snapped. Hayes barely had time to breathe before two guards rushed in. One grabbed him from behind, but Hayes threw an elbow into the man's ribs, twisting out of his grip. The second lunged with a baton, but Hayes ducked, grabbing a metal pipe from the floor and swinging hard. Crack! The man hit the ground, groaning. Voss scrambled for his gun, but suddenly froze. Because in that moment, the second lion cub had leaped onto a crate and knocked over a stack of documents. Papers scattered everywhere. Hayes's eyes widened. The documents were shipping manifests, illegal transactions, money transfers, proof of everything Voss had tried to hide. The billionaire's face drained of color. Hayes grinned. "Looks like you just confessed," he muttered. Then, sirens. Flashing blue and red lights flooded the warehouse as officers stormed in. Leah had published the story. The world knew. Voss barely had time to react before he was tackled to the ground by officers. "Dominic Voss, you're under arrest for wildlife trafficking, illegal smuggling, and conspiracy to commit murder," a senior officer declared, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Hayes stood over him, chest rising and falling, still catching his breath. Voss laughed bitterly as he was pulled to his feet. "You think this means anything?" he sneered. "Guys like me? We don't stay locked up." Hayes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This time, you will." And he meant it, because this time the world was watching. In the chaos, Hayes rushed to where the lioness had been kept. The moment he entered, she lifted her head weakly. The cubs immediately ran to her, pressing against her fur, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Hayes let himself feel relief. He knelt beside her, brushing his hand over one of the cubs. "You made it," he whispered. And for the first time the mother lion truly looked at him. Not with fear, not with pain, but with recognition. She knew he had saved them. By morning, Voss's empire was crumbling. News channels ran footage of the trafficked animals, the secret documents, the full extent of his crimes. International authorities were investigating his connections. The world had turned against him. Hayes watched the headlines with a satisfied smirk. The system had failed before. But not this time. The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vast wildlife sanctuary, its open fields stretching beyond the fences. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the sound of birds, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls. Standing near the enclosure's entrance, Officer Daniel Hayes watched as the lioness, once frail and near death, now stood tall, her strength slowly returning. It had been 3 weeks since Voss's arrest. The rescue team had done everything they could to save her. Multiple surgeries, weeks of medical treatment, and round-the-clock care had given her a fighting chance. And today, she was finally free. From behind the fence, her twin cubs sat close together, watching her with wide, eager eyes. They had been inseparable from Hayes since the night of the warehouse raid. And now, they watched their mother with uncertainty, almost as if asking permission to leave the man who had protected them. The lioness turned her head slightly, her amber eyes locking onto Hayes. He could have sworn, just for a second, there was recognition in them. Then, with a slow, deep breath, she let out a soft huff, a sound of acknowledgement. She stepped forward into the open sanctuary, her paws pressing into the sunlit grass. And just like that, she was home. A voice broke the silence. "She's lucky," said Dr. Ellen Carter, the lead veterinarian. She stood beside Hayes, arms crossed as she watched the lioness disappear into the distance. "Most animals don't get a second chance like this." Hayes nodded. "Yeah, she fought hard for it." Then, he felt something at his leg. Looking down, he saw one of the cubs pawing at his boot, while the other nestled against his calf. Hayes sighed. "They don't want to leave me, do they?" Ellen smirked. "Nope. And can you blame them? You've been their protector since day one." The cubs had grown attached, following him around the sanctuary, curling up against his side when he sat, even pawing at his uniform whenever he tried to walk away. They saw him as their guardian, and a part of him realized he wasn't ready to let them go either. Later that week, Hayes stood outside his police precinct waiting for his meeting with Chief Dawson. The headlines had been relentless. "Corrupt billionaire arrested in wildlife trafficking ring" and "Cop goes rogue to save lion cubs" were plastered across the news. Most expected Hayes to lose his badge for going against orders, but when the chief finally stepped out, he simply sighed. "You really know how to make my life difficult, Hayes." Hayes smirked. "It's a skill." Dawson exhaled and crossed his arms. "The department was ready to suspend you. Hell, some wanted to fire you, but with all the media coverage—" He shook his head. "They're calling you a hero." Hayes raised a brow. "And what do you think?" The chief was quiet for a moment. Then, with a rare smirk, he said, "I think you did the right thing." Hayes nodded, relief washing over him. "So I'm not fired?" Dawson rolled his eyes. "No, But don't make a habit of this, Hayes. The conversation was over, but Hayes knew what wasn't said out loud. The system had failed once, but this time he had fought back, and this time they had won. Days later, Hayes found himself back at the wildlife sanctuary, kneeling beside the twin cubs. The director had offered to transfer them to another reserve, somewhere deeper in the wild. But Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they belonged with him. "They're still young," Ellen had told him. "If they're kept in captivity too long, they won't survive in the wild." Hayes had spent days wrestling with the decision. He wasn't a zoo, he wasn't a wildlife expert. But looking at the cubs now, their eyes filled with trust, their small paws resting against his leg, he knew the answer. A week later, standing on the porch of his countryside home, Hayes watched as the cubs ran through his enclosed land. They pounced on each other, tumbling through the grass, their golden coats shining in the sunlight. They were safe. They were home. One of the cubs trotted toward him, placing a tiny paw against his knee. The other followed suit, pawing at his uniform, as if thanking him. Hayes chuckled and ruffled their fur. "You two aren't going anywhere, are you?" The cubs let out soft, playful growls, pressing against him. Hayes let out a breath, looking at the land around him. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. And for the first time ever, he knew. He wasn't alone anymore. The golden afternoon sunlight stretched across the open fields, casting a warm glow over the rolling grasslands surrounding Daniel Hayes's secluded home. The air was crisp, carrying the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. In the distance, the twin lion cubs tumbled through the grass, their tiny bodies full of energy. They were playing, truly playing, for the first time. Not running in fear, not hiding, just being cubs. Hayes leaned against the wooden fence, arms crossed, watching them with a rare, genuine smile. He had spent so much of his life alone, drifting from case to case, never putting down roots. But now he had a reason to stay. One of the cubs, the slightly bolder one, charged forward, kicking up dirt as it chased an invisible enemy. The other followed, tumbling into its twin and sending them both into a playful wrestling match. Hayes chuckled. "They never run out of energy," a voice commented from behind him. He turned to see Dr. Ellen Carter, arms crossed as she watched the cubs. "They're happy," she added. "You did good, Hayes." Hayes exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know if I did good, Ellen. I broke half a dozen rules, almost lost my badge, and pissed off some very powerful people." Ellen smirked. "And yet, you still came out on top." Hayes let out a short laugh. "Guess I did." For a moment, they both stood in silence, watching the cubs chase each other. Then Ellen nudged his arm. "So, you really keeping them?" Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know." The cubs chose that exact moment to pounce on his boots, tugging at his pant leg with their tiny teeth. Ellen raised an eyebrow. Hayes smirked. "Yeah, guess I do know." Just as Hayes was about to say something else, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He frowned, glancing at the caller ID. Leah Foster. Why was she calling? "Hayes," he answered. On the other end, Leah's voice was low, serious. "We need to talk. I just uncovered something. And it's big." Hayes straightened. "Bigger than Voss?" "Maybe," she said. "Meet me in town. I'll explain everything then." The line went dead. Hayes lowered the phone, his jaw tightening. Ellen noticed his change in expression. That didn't sound like good news. "Probably isn't," he admitted. She eyed him carefully. "You gonna take it?" Hayes hesitated. Then, one of the cubs nudged against his leg, rubbing its head against him. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. They trusted him completely now, something that would have never happened before. Hayes crouched down, running a hand over their fur, feeling their warmth. Then he let out a slow, steady breath. "I think I already have everything I need," he murmured. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some battles never really end. As the sun began to set, Hayes stood with his arms resting on the fence, watching over his new family. The cubs curled up beside him, their tiny tails flicking lazily. One of them snuggled into his side, letting out a tiny, contented huff. Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I get it, he murmured. I'm not going anywhere. The camera pulls back, showing the man who once worked alone, now surrounded by the family he never knew he needed. Then, in the distance, the sound of a phone buzzing again. A reminder that trouble was never too far away. But for now, everything was exactly as it should be. Like, subscribe, and comment if you'd fight to protect these twin lion cubs like Officer Hayes did.